And we're live.
Hello and welcome to the CLE group chat. Today is October 28th, 2017, and with us we have Jeannie from Australia, and we have Christopher from Indiana who started this ministry. My name's Joshua. We only allow our church group all these video calls, but you can still watch and use a live chat. And without further ado, I suppose we'll start. But before we get really into the article, before I start reading it, you're going to need some context on this one. So first, I wrote down some notes. So there was an act passed in 1992, and that law required that all the records concerning the JFK assassination be publicly disclosed in full. And they had a 25-year deadline, and now it's 2017. That was in 1992. So the deadline's up, so now they have to release all these files on the JFK assassination. But the thing is, they released 2,800 out of like 33,000 or so that they had. So they're keeping.
They have to pass a law for that in the first place because all classified files are supposed to be declassified after 25 years. So they waited almost 30 years to say, well, you must release it. So that doubly means that something was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and they still don't want to release all of them. And then they're like, well, in 6 months, we'll release some more and we'll just keep the money.
I can tell you part of the reason is because of who was involved.
Yeah, they don't want people to know. I saw a memo from J. Edgar Hoover saying that he spoke with the agent in charge in Dallas that day, who just happened to be George Bush Sr. So no, the Bushes aren't going to want their involvement known.
Right, and that's exactly what I was saying, is that, it's because of who is involved in it. They don't want the full disclosed details of who was actually in charge and heading up the investigations and who was, because George Bush Sr. along with J. Edgar Hoover George Bush Sr. was in the CIA and involved in the operations that had to do with that. That's I can't give you a bunch of details off the top of my head, but I remember reading the same documents that Jeannie's talking about.
So if there's no more thoughts, then I'll continue with the article. And it's from the Washington Post, and it's titled, JFK Assassination Records, the Promise of Revelations Derailed by CIA and FBI. And the article says, they've been waiting 25 years to see the final and potentially most sensitive batch of records related to President John F. Kennedy's assassination. Then came word late Thursday that President Trump had acquiesced the CIA and FBI lobbying to withhold tens of thousands of files. For historians, journalists, and Kennedy buffs, the promise of revelations about what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, disappeared. My expectations, were low, and they would have been lower, said Gerald Ponzer, author of the 1993 Kennedy assassination book, Case Closed.
Here's the bottom line on what people think about. If, let's say, a murder happened in your town, okay? The police got together one of the suspects, and they say, we believe this is the guy who committed the murder. Now, in order to get him put away, you're going to want to bring out as much evidence as possible that proves he was the person that committed the crime. This is just, common sense. This isn't something that you even have to think about. You're like, yeah, that's right. There's still a bunch of people out here who listen, who still turn on their televisions and watch all these detective shows. They do the exact same thing in those. But then when it comes to reality, it's like people think the opposite. It's like, okay, well, there must be nothing else going on. I know they're hiding, tens of thousands of pages of documented evidence on the matter, but they couldn't be hiding anything. Well, if you really want to condemn this guy who they claim was the lone gunman who shot him, well, then release all the documents so you have tons of evidence on the subject. But that's not what they're doing because that guy was not really involved. There's a whole I'm not going to get into it right now.
Well, he was probably involved at on some level, but not. He wasn't the actual shooter. I mean, he was a CIA patsy. He said that he was, but the government's doing the, not to change the subject, but the government's doing the same thing with the Vegas shooting now. Tons of people have come forward saying that there was multiple shooters, and the FBI and the police department asked people to turn in all their cell phones and computers where they had footage of it, and they get their stuff back, and the memory's been wiped. All the videos and audios have been wiped if they've turned them in. And there are at least 5 that I know of, witnesses who described multiple shooters who mysteriously died afterwards. One was shot in front of his house. Another one was, he and his wife were killed in a car crash that burned the car completely, and another woman died alone in her house. So, you tell me there isn't something going on there.
Did you ever see the video where they showed it right after the assassination? Everybody goes running in one direction, right? Because or one general direction. There's a couple directions they were running from because, like she said, multiple people said they heard shots coming from multiple directions. There may have been multiple gunmen. We have no idea. But the point is, or they may have been, well, okay, you just fire a shot, you fire a blank here to create confusion on the matter. It could have been the case as well. I don't know. But there was a video that while people were running in these different general directions, there's one lady who is walking the opposite direction. She's very casually just walking the opposite direction of everybody else. Really, really weird. I saw that one time, and they were asking, was this woman ever questioned? No, nobody knows who she is. Nobody ever stopped her to question her on what she was doing, why she was acting so strange. Nobody really, so there's a lot of details and just mysterious unknown things about it that without the actual files, you're not going to be able to determine anything factually. So that's why a lot of this stuff, people love discussing it so much, is because it's so much open to theory. Like, there could be this, and then people talk about it endlessly, but we don't have the facts. And if people think that they're going to get all these documents and they're going to be completely open with everything, that's not going to happen. It hasn't happened over the past, 50 years? It's not going to happen anytime soon.
The article continues. Though the National Archives and Records Administration put 2,800 records online, about 30,000 more remain concealed at the urging of national security officials. On Friday, WikiLeaks offered $100,000 for the still withheld documents. On Twitter, the organization's founder, Julian Assange, polled followers over President Trump's About page. Why did U.S. intelligence agencies fail to meet the legal deadline they had 25 years notice of for the release of all remaining JFK files by today, he asked. The choices: show power over Trump, ruin Trump's PR move, serious incompetence, or conceal activities.
CIA is pretty much a law unto itself. They don't recognize any law other than what they want to do.
Okay.
JFK was assassinated because he messed up a CIA operation. He messed up the Bay of Pigs and exposed the CIA involvement in that, and they didn't like it. He wasn't playing ball with them, so they got rid of him.
Okay, so there's another factor that they don't list in that, they don't put in that list that you mentioned. It's called laziness. And for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's government employees. Number 2, because there's a whole thing you go into about government employees, especially in the United States, it's difficult for them to lose their job. Really difficult. There's so many testimonies I've read and things I've heard about of people taking up to 1.5 years to fire someone out of a government position. So it's because there's so much red tape to get through. But laziness, number one, and number two, especially if you happen to know that your government has no intention of ever releasing those files ever, no matter what laws are passed, then why would you spend all the time working on making sure certain, because I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, you have to make sure that certain key pieces of information that cannot be just released to the international world who would see all these have got to be, you got to put the little black lines over them so people can't see someone's personal information or something like that that's going to be given out. You can't allow terrorist cells and things like that to see. I know what they say, right? But at the same time, then how do you know that the people who are covering up that information, that is actually being covered up to prevent it from going to terror cells? How do you know that's covered up to prevent the public from ever knowing about it? Well, it's in black. There's just black lines on it. You can't tell. There's no third party here to determine whether or not the people are actually doing their job. You just have to trust them. So it could be that they're trying to do that, or it could, when you have to, if your job was to sit down and read through 33,000 documents for just to check for information that could be potentially harmful to the United States if it got outside of it, right? Talk about the most boring job on the planet. And it could be just flat out laziness, that there's more interesting things to work on and nobody really wants to do it. So I'm not saying there isn't conspiracy from people preventing those files from coming out. That could be the case. But on the flip side, a lot of those documents could come out and they could just, marker out all those lines, just like they say they do. Is like, oh, this is sensitive information. We can't release this kind of stuff. And they could do that. But to have somebody sit down and go through some 20,000 some odd documents that are still left, they can't even keep enough employees in the IRS to pay them, right? That's why they had to cut all their or at least lay off all the IRS workers that they used to have, because they cut all the funding there. They're cutting funding in different places because we're running out of money. When you do things like the Obamacare junk and all this garbage, you're running out of money. So they can't hire enough people to go through all the stuff to release those things in the first place. So unless people want to deal with the matters that are in front of us, like basic things, right? Like you have people that they can, this is one of the ones I was thinking about today. They complain about the economy. I'm really tired of hearing that phrase. Oh, it's the economy. The economy is bad. The economy sounds like it's this person that's long ago and far away, and he's some bad guy that's doing something, and that no American has any personal responsibility for the economy. All right, because how they spend their money has no effect on the economic state of affairs in the United States. That's kind of how they treat that. So if they would first deal with such problems, then we would have more access to get people to deal with other such things like this. But again, when people need to eat, and you have to have, and while the government wants to have military bases in about, in almost all 280 countries around the world, when you've got money flowing out to and trying to balance things that a handful of people want versus what the people actually need, we have priorities, and the JFK assassination is not one of them, especially when it's 50 years gone. Now, of course, it was number one priority in 1963 and 1964. Priority one, everything, that was main thing in the media. But it's like today, how strong and prevalent is the 9/11 truth movement? And just think about that. Back at that day, it was priority one for everything. Now, here we are, 15 years later, and everybody's like, oh yeah, tragedy, whatever. It's the same thing. So there's priorities that have to take place, and then of course, when people don't take personal responsibility for things, well, there's all sorts of stuff I could talk about. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic, and I'm not going to go into that. I apologize.
Well, on the other hand, though, this information is 54 years old. What could be so sensitive now that they have to redact it all? Why bother?
They can embarrass themselves.
The only reason they don't want it out is because it's going to embarrass some people, and they don't want certain people. certain people don't want their involvement known.
And it continues. Early Friday morning, the president tweeted assurances to those infuriated by the delay that he wants to disclose as much as possible. JFK files are being carefully released. In the end, there will be great transparency. It is my hope to get just about everything to the public. Trump followed up that message Friday evening with another tweet saying, after strict consultation with General Kelly and the CIA and other agencies, I will be releasing all JFK files other than the names and addresses of any mentioned person who is still living. I am doing this for reasons of full disclosure, transparency, and in order to put an end to all conspiracy theories to rest. Oh, yeah. Put all conspiracy theories to rest. He did not say when he would release the remaining documents. Peter Kornblue, a Cuba specialist at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, said he too was frustrated because the government had 25 years to make the deadline imposed by President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. The law required that all the records shall be publicly disclosed in full. But the act came with an asterisk, allowing the president to withhold documents beyond October 26, 2017, if he decided the disclosure would harm national security. I have no choice today but to accept those redactions rather than allow potentially irreversible harm to our nation's security, Trump wrote in a memo Thursday night. Many leading Kennedy experts weren't buying it. Kornblue, the Cuba authority, said most of the papers that were released didn't warrant the long secrecy. He pointed to a never-before-seen memo by Hoover, dated 2 days after the assassination. Hoover says in the memo that he wanted to have something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin, and that he thought the investigation should be kept secret because of Oswald's, the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, and the Soviet embassy in Washington. What is the secret?
What you have to understand is that there's still stuff that is not being admitted to. For example, like Operation Northwoods, which was in 1962. So that would have been the year before the Kennedy assassination. And of course, this is where the American government blamed, I forget the entire thing that happened, but they blamed some act of terrorism on the Cuban government to justify a war against Cuba. And this whole thing started to break, and there's a bunch of people denying involvement in it. The problem is that there's a bunch of people that would have been involved in such a thing that are still alive today. So protecting national security is basically protecting the people who are involved under the title of what we would call national security. That's what's really protecting. It's not protecting our security as much as it's protecting the people that were actually involved in the conspiracies themselves. So when you understand that there were other things going on, major things going on, like Operation Northwoods, right around the same time as the Kennedy assassination, you can see how some of these files and these letters are going to get mixed up because they're going to be addressing multiple things, multiple topics within these letters back and forth to each other. And it's going to open people up to, wait a second, what were they talking about there? And that's the kind of stuff that they want to remove.
And I'm sure Trump saying he had no choice but to accept the redactions implies that if you don't play ball with us, we're going to get rid of you like we did Kennedy.
And it continues. What is the secrecy around the document really about? Asked Kornblue, who authored a 2014 book on the United States secret diplomacy with Cuba called Back Channel to Cuba. For Kornblue, some of the more intriguing documents in the entire Kennedy collection were not released Thursday. He was hoping to see the files on Luis Pasado Carriles, who had been given explosives training by the CIA as part of the Bay of Pigs invasion and was later implicated in several terrorist attacks. We could learn the degree to which he worked for the CIA, his operations, and the whole history of how he left the CIA and went to Valencia to plan the bombing of a Cuban airliner in 1976 that killed 73 men, women, and children, Kornblue said.
Sound familiar?
What do you mean?
CIA trains these people, people turn against them, and all of a sudden they're a problem. Now, did these people actually commit what they were accused of? The CIA trained Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to get the Russians out of Afghanistan. But did Osama bin Laden actually have anything to do with 9/11? I mean, and you know, there's so many. ISIS was originally trained by the CIA. They are CIA assets. Nobody's telling you that.
Yeah, I never heard of something like that happen before, but I like the points you made. Relations. And the article continues. He was intrigued by some released records Thursday, including a 1975 report by White House counsel Philip Buchin, who summarized the CIA's assassination plots against foreign leaders. Some of the more eye-popping details included a proposed government operation to induce Cubans to overthrow their government, with financial rewards for various types of Cuban leaders, up to $100,000 for government officials and perhaps for symbolic reasons, 2 cents for Castro. The price list appears to be new, Kornblue said. I think it is one of the most comprehensive summaries of real and proposed assassination operations against Castro that I have ever read, and I have read all of them. Trump on Thursday gave intelligence agencies until March to propose which redactions they still want to preserve. By April 26, Trump will make another decision on what to release and what to withhold. Rex Bradford, president of the Mary Farrell Foundation, which collects documents on numerous government investigations, said he worries the 6-month delay after a 25-year wait just makes it harder to suppress the rampant myths surrounding the murder.
And the reason he says that is because the order to bring out all the documents and release them immediately would be like a surprise attack.
I am sure that withholding fuels conspiracy theorists, Bradford said. At the same time, we have some sympathy for agencies who would rather not reveal sensitive or embarrassing information. In some cases, those are legitimate positions. But many others feel like at this point, the public interest far outweighs those concerns. The material proved daunting to media organizations, amateur sleuths, and experts alike. Each agency has its own language of acronyms and euphemisms that take time to learn.
Anyway, sorry, I paused on the last thing I was saying to finish out my point because I was looking at something on the screen. The point being is that if you give them enough time, like for example 6 months, then they'll say, okay, emergency, let's get together these military personnel from these different secretaries. You all gather into a room. Here's boxes of documents. Start going through them and start, that'll give them 6 months of time to be able to go through this stuff. Of course, these are probably things that Trump agreed to try to keep the peace, right? And I'm sure he was given like 15,000 excuses as to why they needed 6 months for this. And so what he's saying is that if you surprise attack them and you just release all the documents, then we can get more of the truth out. The problem is we can't when they're trying to cover up for their own messes, which is exactly what they're trying to do. And I'm sure Trump's been feeling it. Well, if this operation we did here gets out to this country, they'll be angry at us or something. Basically, it's a bunch of junk that America has done wrong, and they're trying to protect themselves and calling it national security, when really they're just trying to protect themselves.
Often, seemingly simple terms are deliberately misused, wrote Greg Bradshaw, a senior archivist at the National Archives at College Park. In a blog, he said that in a blog. It goes on, a highly reliable informant could actually be a microphone. Special or sensitive investigative techniques could be code for break-ins, and illegally obtained dirt could be disguised as information from a confidential informant. The Hoover memo drew the most attention from media outlets and on social media. Hoover said the FBI had repeatedly warned Dallas police about threats against Oswald in the hours after Kennedy's assassination.
But you see, that key thing that they said is something that they're trying to. Where's this article from again?
The Washington Post.
Okay, so what they're trying to do, because this is mainstream, okay, is trying to explain to people, here's an example of sensitive information they would have to make sure they scratch out. And they said the name of a CI, or that's confidential informant, right? So if you got a CI out in the field, you don't want to blow their cover because they can die instantly if that information gets out. 54 years ago, okay, I highly doubt they have had a CI in a particular location for 54 years. The time is probably passed for that information to come out, although you can stop and consider, well, the person may be alive there, that information getting out might get them in trouble with some people. That is particularly understandable, but at the same time, it's been 54 years, okay? And yes, they might have helped with some information, but that doesn't mean that, the truth is going to have to come out one way or another. Either in this life or the Lord Jesus Christ is going to make all truth come out one way or another. And so for the people to say, well, we want to protect our CIs, yes, I understand that, but at the same time, we're dealing with a criminal assassination that took place at the highest levels of our government. You're going to have to throw some of that out the window to get down to the truth of the matter. But nonetheless, one way or another, we all know there was a conspiracy to kill, and we know that the government was involved. Those two things we can determine fairly clearly by how secretive this has all been and how many confusing things would have had to happen. I mean, the magic bullet analysis alone would be enough to just, it'll blow your mind how ridiculous, if you've never studied this magic bullet and what would have happened, what would have had to happen, how the laws of physics would have had to been defied in a way that is unexplainable, period. It's one of the most ridiculous explanations I've ever seen in any conspiracy that's ever been presented in the United States history.
Last night we received
how it actually went, how it went through John Connolly, and who was hit in the lower body, and then all of a sudden flew up to blow Kennedy's head off.
Yeah, it did a backflip and then switched angles, and that's the way you have to do it. There's literally, the bullet would have had to do its own gymnastics.
And it continues. Last night we received a call in our Dallas office from a man talking in a calm voice and saying he was a member of a committee organized to kill Oswald. Hoover reported, we at once notified the chief of police, and he assured us Oswald would be given sufficient protection. This morning we called the chief of police again, warning of the possibility of some effort against Oswald, and again he assured us adequate protection would be given. However, this was not done. The Miami New Times found a memo discussing a false flag operation that never came to fruition. According to the memo, the CIA considered creating a false communist Cuban terror campaign to turn the public against the Cuban Revolution. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated, an official road. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. British media jumped all over an FBI file claiming that a local newspaper, the Cambridge News, had received a tip about some big news in the United States shortly before the assassination. The caller said only that the Cambridge...
I'm sorry.
Yes?
One of the reasons I'm thinking these alleged shooters, you know, I'm comparing Oswald with Stephen Paddock here too, is they conveniently get rid of these people so that there doesn't have to be a trial. Because if there was a trial, there would be all sorts of information coming out that they don't want released. You would have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he did it if he was to go to trial and be punished. Well, he's already dead, so he did it, and then that's it. And they don't have to make a public trial out of it.
The caller said...
Yeah, the way we set it up, if you disagree, we'll get rid of you too.
The caller said only that the Cambridge News reporter should call the American Embassy in London for some big news and then hung up. CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton wrote to Hoover, after the word of the president's death was received, the reporter informed the Cambridge police of an anonymous call, and the police informed MI5. The important point is that the call was made according to MI5's calculations about 25 minutes before the president was shot. The paper reported Friday it had never been able to figure out whether the call was made. That's the end of the article. So there's no more thoughts. I'll move on. And an article from the New York Magazine titled Trump's Spiritual Advisor Authorizes Him to Smite North Korea. At a time when the president is publicly threatening North Korea with fire and fury like the world has never seen, one of his most prominent conservative evangelical backers, Dr. Robert Jeffress of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, wanted Trump and everyone else to know that no namby-pamby Christian scruples about turning the other cheek or loving one's enemies should inhibit Trump.
Listen, I'm not very up to date on foreign policy. What's the problem with North Korea right now between us and them?
Well, this one's from August, and Jeannie, you would know, you'd be able to explain it a lot better.
I'm just asking anybody. Does anybody know?
Trump's been rattling his cage for ages. So he's been testing nuclear. He's been done a lot of nuclear testing. And now he's threatening this week or next week sometime. I'm not sure exactly when he's supposed to do, but he's threatened to, or he says he's going to test a ballistic missile and detonate it over the Pacific Ocean, which would create an EMP and immediately kill hundreds of thousands of people, because there would be all these planes flying over Japan, Indonesia, whatever, falling out of the sky. So
okay. Just like Steve was saying in chat, he's saying they're developing intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. So this is a threat to us because of our military in the Pacific, and because it would affect people on the West Coast. Is that correct?
But the problem is North Korea wouldn't be a problem if Trump had done what he said he was going to do when he was campaigning and gone to talk to the guy. But no, after he gets into
Does
office,
he have an
he
opportunity
says
to
there
talk
will be
with
no
them yet?
contact, and it just starts doing military exercises in the Sea of Japan and the South China Sea, and making all these threatening moves towards him to make him react, so that we can be justified in going to war with him.
And then Kevin points out that it's thermonuclear warheads to H bombs, not just A bombs. And I'm sure that will heavily affect him since he lives in New Zealand up there. So if they start popping those things off, that's going to affect a bunch of you guys out there. So
yeah, I'm a little too close for comfort too.
Right. So that's I mean, that's just a country doing what a country does. I mean, why do you need a spiritual advisor to tell you, okay, I guess, how could you explain this in a very simplistic way? We have, okay, you live in a town, and the town next to you uh, doesn't like where you're putting in new parking spaces. Maybe there's a new store that's opened up and doesn't like you putting in new parking spaces. So what they're going to do is start firing a potato gun at the local shop. Okay. Now, if the city gets the town mayor rallies up the sheriff and deputies, and they go out to the other town and they start arresting people, and there's like, hey, you're outside your jurisdiction. They said, too bad, because you firing this potato gun over here, yeah, you're not only going to do property damage, but you're also, I mean, that could hit somebody and kill them. And so just because you want to play around with your toys doesn't give you a right to do it. And so, I mean, this is like the same concept. Why do you need a spiritual advisor for the government to punish evildoers for what they're doing? Right? You don't need a spiritual advisor for that. That's the government's job, is the punishment of evildoers. I mean, read Romans 13 very carefully. It says they are for your protection, for your good. If they are there protecting you from something that is actually a threat, and it's not like, okay, it's not like China and Japan and Australia and New Zealand and all these other places are not, and Russia, they're not, it's like, well, we're not agreeing with you, United States, going against Korea on this one. Why wouldn't they? They're all going to be affected by this too. So it can't be just the United States. I mean, they're gonna open up a whole can of worms on this one. So talking about, well, his spiritual advisor gave him the okay. Oh, Trump had to go to his priest to say, what should I do, priest? And so I guess, who's the real commander in chief there?
Thomas Jeffress told
By the
CBN's.
way, okay, sorry, you just mentioned that name. Does anybody know who this guy is? I've never heard of him. Not that I really care, but for the context of what we're talking about, it might be nice to know something about him. Does anybody know anything about him?
He's a mega church pastor in Dallas, Texas. That's basically all I know. I mentioned him once in a previous Google Hangout.
Really, what was that about?
I think he was getting on the case because they were doing something with the Easter. I can't remember. It was something to do with Easter eggs, and he was getting on the case.
Oh, the Easter egg stuff. I was about to say, he's not the guy that made the giant wooden cross on training wheels and dragged it along.
No,
I was about to say this was going to get golden if it was, but that's okay. But so he's just trying to make this super mega amazing Easter egg hunt that's better than your neighbor's super mega Easter egg hunt, right? Because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to outdo each other. How many eggs can we do this year? How many things can we drop out of helicopters? All for the sake of the Lord Jesus Christ, you know. That's okay. So that's the same guy. That's enough context for me.
Thomas Jeffress told CBN's David Brody that the president was God's instrument for smiting the evil Kim Jong-un. When it comes to how we should deal with evildoers, the Bible in the book of Romans is very clear. God has endowed rulers full power to use whatever means necessary, including war, to stop evil. In the case of North Korea, God has given Trump authority to take out Kim Jong-un. I'm heartened to see that our president, contrary to what we've seen with past administrations who have taken at best a sheepish stance towards dictators and oppressors, he will not tolerate any threat against the American people. President Trump.
Part of the reason maybe he didn't because that's what Jeannie was talking about, right? You go over, why don't you just talk to the guy? Now, I don't know whether he's even had an opportunity to talk to the guy. Maybe there's requests been made and this guy refuses to talk. I don't know. And
actually, before Trump was elected, Kim Jong-un said he was looking forward to talking to Trump. No American leader, no American president has ever gone to talk to the leader of North Korea. Nixon was the first one to talk to China, but nobody's ever gone to talk to North Korea.
Well, that's interesting because I didn't realize that. That actually changes quite a few things about the perspective I had on it, because I thought it was an issue where he couldn't go talk to him. Because I thought Kim Jong-un would be like, oh, okay, if I go talk to Trump, he's just going to rage at me and say, we're going to build a giant wall around Korea. That's gonna fix everything. I don't know whether, what Trump
it's
like
beyond talking now. I mean, that horse has left the barn. But before Trump was elected, Trump said he was going to go talk to the guy. Kim Jong-un was all for it, and then Trump started all of these war games, and Kim Jong-un said, "Yeah, forget it. We're just going to do what we need to do to protect our country." Because the United States is obviously wanting to.
Well, I mean, here's the thing: it's not necessarily a bad thing, one way or another, because if Korea understands that we mean business, if you're going to fire this stuff off, we're going to war, and it's going to be bad. So if Korea understands this, then going forward, they might be a little bit more careful and cautious to say, okay, let us consider that there are other countries around us who have citizens as well, and they're not necessarily going to approve of what we're doing. But I don't really know what this guy is, leader in Korea, what his beliefs are. I mean, I don't know whether he's an atheist or I don't know what they've got. So I can't. It's hard to determine what his philosophy is unless you determine that. And then most of the time, you're going to have a situation where presidential leaders and all that, they don't take into consideration. They're like, oh, we just have to respect everybody's religion. Let's respect all and they don't take into consideration that religion produces philosophy. That's where I was pointing out there was a guy I was listening to one time it's part of the movement that's trying to expose the social justice warriors and all that. And I listened to him talk one time and I was like, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. This very, very intelligent guy. He was super smart, way smarter than me. But he said one of the dumbest things I ever heard. He says, we shouldn't focus on their religion. We should focus on their philosophy. I said, what? Your religion creates the philosophy. Where do you think it comes from? They just wake up one day and then they said, well, this is the way of thinking. I'm going to choose that one. That's not what they do. I mean, it's just insane. So they never look at the philosophy that they have and then try to address that because they don't look at the religion that they've got to see what they do. So I don't know what his religion is over there. There's a whole bunch of stuff I don't know, and I apologize. I shouldn't even be really talking. I'm basically just asking questions because when it comes to geography and foreign policy, I'm an idiot for the most part.
Well, the CIA has been wanting to take over North Korea ever since World War II. I mean, that's why we got into the Korean War, and they've never really given up on that goal. And see, the thing that people forget is if we get into a war with North Korea, that's going to bring China in. And they've got way more people than we do.
When President Trump draws a red line, he will not erase it, move it, or back away from it. Thank God for a president who is serious about protecting our country.
Yeah, because Trump realizes it's not the amount of people, the population you have that wins a war, it's the number of robots you have.
Jeffress, who delivered the sermon. Well, what do you mean by robots?
It's a joke. I just meant it depends on who has the most technology, who has the most warheads, who has this and that. But, skip it 15 years into the future, right? Or 150 years in the future. Okay, everything's drones and robots, and who has the most robots? It's basically BattleBots International.
Jeffress, who delivered the sermon at the official pre-inaugural worship service in January, is alluding to a brief passage in the 13th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, that Romans 13, that calls secular authorities God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. In this,
I'll tell you why all of you listening to this have a sour taste in your mouth while listening to this guy say this. I don't mean Josh, this guy. I mean the guy he's quoting. The reason you have a sour taste in your mouth is because he's 501c3 incorporated. He himself is really trying to use Romans 13 in the wrong way. He doesn't understand fully the meaning of it anyway in the first place. And on top of that, governments are supposed to specifically, it's supposed to be against if they're doing good to protect the poor and needy, to protect the people who are living as lawfully as citizens, and then they're punishing the evildoers, then that is an appointed person of God to do those things. But if they're doing wicked, they're not. God uses those leaders to exact punishments onto people, but that doesn't mean that they are ordained of him in the same fight. There's stipulations in there for that stuff. And so when I've posted in the past where there's a lot of preachers out there, especially the big time ones that say, well, Romans 13 says we should obey the government, and then they go get 501c3 incorporated. Excuse me, you have lost the context here. Okay, so whoever this mega church leader is, he's a hypocrite. And that's why there's like a sour taste in your mouth while you're listening to say this stuff. I just want to point that out.
In this, as in other biblical interpretations that suit his purpose, Jeffress is taking the authorization of violence quite literally. In a follow-up phone interview with the Washington Post, Jeffress cheerfully added that Romans 13 gives the government the authority to do whatever, whether it's assassination, capital punishment, or evil punishment, to quell the actions of evildoers like Kim Jong-un. The Post,
threat to the people, right? Because basically, I mean, then you've got the issue of, well, only if it's a threat to the people. Because then when we're going and invading a country on false pretenses, then that's done based on a lie, and then the country that's invading is the evildoer. So we got to make sure that it's done on for the right reason.
Yeah, like our false pretenses for invading Iraq and all of that.
Sorry, you said like, and then immediately I'm like, everything, like almost every war that's appeared in American history.
That's very true. You know, in fact, I just read a story the other day again that I had forgotten about. That the excuse for going to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War, when Cuba was fighting for their independence, was we had a ship, the USS Maine, docked in Havana Harbor. Well, it was blown up, and they said it was by a Spanish mine, so we went to war with Spain. 1911, they dragged the ship out of the ocean, take pictures of it, take it apart and everything, and they said, oops, it exploded from the inside out. So, you know, I mean, you've got false pretenses for war at every level. You know, you have the sinking of the Lusitania got us into World War I. The bombing of Pearl Harbor got us into World War II. Well, for like 30 years, the Japanese had a question on the naval officers, their naval academy final. They had the question said, how would you carry out a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? And they, you know, this was a question for a number of years. So, I mean, tell me that there's just too much there I could get into. I could go on all day about this. I mean, why was the radio operator asleep? Why did they ignore the planes coming over? Well, maybe they thought they were ours, but why didn't they bother to check?
And the article continues. The Post thoughtfully obtained this more nuanced interpretation from Amy Black, a professor at Wheaton College, a conservative evangelical institution. Theologians and church leaders have debated the interpretation of Romans 13 for millennia, Black said. Most mainstream interpretations of the passage, she said, would suggest that God works through governmental agencies, but ultimate authority comes from God. Out among Christians in Germany during World War II over how to interpret this passage. Some Christians believe they should follow the government, while others set up a resistance movement. If anything, Romans 13 creates a conundrum because it could be interpreted that Kim Jong-un has authority to govern, she said. More to the immediate point, if the Almighty would show Trump some work to take out, I'm going to try that again. More to the immediate point, if the Almighty would show Trump some way to take out Kim Jong-un without taking out hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of bystanders in a bloody nuclear confrontation, Jeffress' bland authorization of fire and fury might be more reticent.
You mean like God would show him how to be tactful and start a conversation? That probably would have been point one. But you see how what they're already addressing is what I already said. When you talk about Romans 13, and what they do is they already give a false dichotomy there, or a false dilemma where you give two options, neither of which is correct. It's like you either got to be on this side or you're going to be on that side. Are you Republican or Democrat? Which one? No. Where they said, well, you either believe you follow the government or you set up rebellion. Wait a second. Why does it have to be one or the other? Why are you forcing us into this? This is what the media does all the time. The problem is what I said earlier, is that there's a specific context in which Romans 13 fits into, okay? Which means the specific stipulation that they are punishing evildoers. They were doing good unto the citizens that are doing good. But when they become bad, or they do evil unto good citizens, then the government is bad. And so it says governments are ordained of God under that specific condition. So you see where they brought up an interesting point of a contradiction in beliefs. Yes, there is a contradiction on those beliefs when they have that false dichotomy. See what I mean? Because what they believe is they like, well, should we? But you see, Kim Jong-il, he is also a government leader. Well, isn't he ordained of God too? You see the problem here? And yeah, that does become a contradiction, almost like, and then people say, well, the Bible's just one big contradiction. No, the contradiction comes from the people who are calling themselves Christians and are a bunch of false converts running around and acting like they're of Christ. I mean, it's ridiculous that you can't get down the proper interpretation of Scripture, because basically these people come in, they don't have the Spirit of God, and then they're just interpreting it however they want, and then saying, oh, well, everybody has their own interpretations, and that's ridiculous. There's only one interpretation, and the Bible specifically says that the prophecy of Scripture is of no private interpretation. There's only one. But the problem is that when the natural man comes in to read it, he does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, and they're foolishness to him, and he can't know them. So then they come up with these contradictory theories, and they don't have any idea what the context says.
As it is, he is encouraging the 45th president's already dangerous tendency to view himself as having the tough, if not brutal, qualities his predecessors lacked. The publicist for Jeffress' Little Hymn of Hate, Brody, is currently engaged in co-authoring a spiritual biography of the president, so he knows his man pretty well. Here's what he added to the war chant. Memo to North Korea. With Trump as president, you really don't want to mess with America. This could get really ugly really soon. Trump won't tolerate this for too much longer. It's unsettling, if hardly unprecedented, to see this kind of jingoism and bloodlust from professed disciples of Prince of Peace, particularly when they are friends of a president not known for self-restraint. End of article. So if there's no more thoughts, I suppose we'll close out this week's discussion. All right, so thank you everybody who has watched this. Lord willing, we are going to see you next week.